All right, I'm so glad to be here. This is such a great surprise. I bet you all are surprised too. So who all has ever made a comment to themselves as they were coding within their code itself? Everybody in the room, I'm so glad you're here. So there could be a lot of reasons for that, and since we're such a small room, like maybe we want to like shout back at each other and do stuff like that. Do we feel good about that? Like, why would you make that comment to yourself?
For future me.
Future you? You might have like a variable that you're like, oh shoot, I want to keep this short, but I'm not really super good at naming variables yet. You may have done that whole copy-paste section of code from Stack Overflow and how does it really work? You're not super sure. Anybody else do that? Just me. All right, we got a couple folks. And you want to take care of that future self, as somebody mentioned. But when you made that last comment to yourself, did you think that you were writing documentation? We don't want to be there in that bottom frame. And documentation is what allows our code to be used, expanded, and adapted. And for community, hopefully at some point, we all dream of community being formed around our little baby projects. So when you last wrote that comment into your code, you're probably making a note of something that you thought was unclear at the time or might be unclear in the future. But sometimes we don't think of those comments as documentation. So I started talking to a lot of newer programmers, as I started mentoring, and I was watching a lot of them making these comments to themselves as they go along. And I said, well, why are we doing that? And I found, people were doing this for a lot of different reasons. They were perhaps describing functions. Someone mentioned earlier there might be, an unclear decision or tricky code. And then, or you might have something at the top of a file to help orient people if they're into a new code base, explaining the purpose. All of these helper functions do broadly this and tie in so that you don't have to follow those calls. You might also be using this a little bit as a notepad, or it may guide your future docs. Like if you find, oh, we keep running into problems around these sections, maybe we need to have a whole section on that in our long form docs. So with all these pretty good reasons for using comments, you'd think we would be throwing them willy-nilly everywhere, right? But what's a problem with that?
They're not centralized.
They're not centralized. What's another problem with comments?
People have to write them.
People have to write them. Human beings, gross. Anything else?
People comment differently.
People comment differently. There's one more that I'm really surprised hasn't come out yet, because when I go on the internet and I ask about comments, people scream at me.
People say the code should document itself. You don't need it because I explained it so clearly in how I wrote functions.
They say, I'm God, the God of programmers. And if you don't understand my code, you should just go home and whatnot. So I hear a bunch, there are a bunch of problems about comments. They get kind of a bad rap. In my little stick figure version of myself, here's, comments mean it's time to refactor. You better keep it dry. That's don't repeat yourself. The code should speak for itself, and comments rot. Why are we even putting them there? So one thing that I wanted to address here, it is a really good point. The thing is there's a bit of truth in each of these statements. Comments that are left unattended, they do rot, they do mislead, it's ugly. And possibly if you're seeing a lot of comments in an area, it is time to refactor. But when do we end up refactoring? Often in our workplaces, depending on what stage we're at and what stage our environments are at, we might feel that this new work that we could be doing, like build those features, is given a lot more time and a lot more airtime, and is looked better on as far as promotions go and all of that, than doing the I made it better work. I deleted code, we know that's good, but sometimes it doesn't seem to come across like that. So it may feel like a nice to have. And so, I started wondering, is refactoring in a sense a programmer's version of self-care instead of a big part of their day. So you might feel a little bit like this, like, to get into refactoring. And the real problem here is you may have written code 2 years ago and you keep thinking like, oh, I've got to like go back and fix it and like clean it up. But by the time something has been written 2 years ago, you might need to draw yourself a bubble bath just to calm down thinking about like how much like digging into it you're going to have to do to do that. And obviously you don't want your computer to be in the same tub with water, and I don't know why this person's doing it. It's just not a good scene. And so refactoring, we need to like, find a way to bring that on, beyond an act of self-care. And going back to our comic that I started us off with, if we consider these rotten comments that we always worry about in the context of this comic, it takes on a different meaning. So not only is it just like you need docs to support your community and docs are super important, but also having docs that are outdated mislead. And it's going to like lead someone down the wrong path, at which point they have a pretty good reason to string you up by your tie. So, if we, felt bad for our lizard at the bottom that was about to get the stuffing knocked out of him, like maybe we feel a little less bad now. And there have been real losses that could have been avoided by a well-placed comment. In my research, someone told me about an incredible loss of data that was literally due to a dev changing a value unknowingly within a code base, something that wasn't, that passed a test that probably shouldn't have. And hearing that story, I said, would have been a good place for for a comment that said like, hey, you are above hot lava level, with exclamation points everywhere. Like, should that have been there instead? And especially as someone who's self-taught and kind of figured out how programming works as I went along, I ran into this a lot. Who has asked the internet for advice? We're all programmers. We have probably at some point had to ask the internet for advice. And sometimes they say really conflicting things. Like, my favorite was, I was hearing like, got to keep it dry. I'm the god of programming. I shouldn't have to explain it to you. My code's so clear. And, but we know on the other side of that undocumented code, as seen in our previous comic, is pretty unusable. So, my smiley face turned upside down and we were really, really sad. And it left me in a position where I was trying to figure out what style was best for me. And on the way, I wrote some really ugly code. So are you ready to see some really horrible, ugly code? We're going to play a fun game. It's called Critique Those Comments. So in our first example, I started, this project started as a tutorial, and I said, hey, I want you to know, recruiters, that I didn't write this fully myself. I'm not sure I'm a real programmer yet, so like, here's the tutorial that I started off with. It's right there, see? And so you can go and you can be like, okay, she added all these features, she did all these cool things with it, but she did have this template to start off with. Do people think that's like a reasonable comment to have at the top of a file? It's okay to yell at me. This is like past me. She doesn't even mind anymore.
It can be helpful for documentation for yourself to like remember where the code came from.
Remember where the code came from. Maybe, it's based on an API and something in the API has changed. I know of at least one tutorial that, expected the Twitter API to be a certain way, and then, blah. So yeah, that could be a really good point. Nobody else has opinions? Yeah.
Like, I don't know, maybe this is for me as like an academic, but like it's giving credit to like people.
That's exactly where I was coming from. So I spent, a good many years doing academic work and academic programming before I shifted over. So in my heart, whenever I copy paste anything, I've literally added like, this is where on Stack Overflow it came from, both so that I could go back and see if there was some nuance to the question I was missing, or if I like needed some more clues, as to what the code was actually doing, and also because I didn't want people to think that that was mine. And like that's where my heart is. So it sounds like a good number of us in this room think this is like pretty okay. But let's take a look at this. So back in the day, I worked at MIT, and they're really nice folks. And I worked in the green building, and about 100 feet from my building, there was a student-run climbing wall. Now, you all know the thing about students, right? Where like they come at 2 p.m. and they're like, okay, we're gonna have the climbing wall open for 1 hour. And they like update the schedule. And if you happen to see it, hooray. So basically either all their friends get to go climbing and Veronica misses out, or she needs to find some way to like scrape or ping the website. So I was like, well, they're not gonna let me like have access to their servers, whatever. So I guess I'll just scrape and do a little like check-in periodically, and then I'll have it send me an email. Such a good idea. It was my first time using Beautiful Soup. Anybody love and use Beautiful Soup in here? That's super. You're probably so much better at it than I was. And I was trying to figure out how to use this beautiful library. And I apologize that the comments aren't grayed out or anything. But you know, I did some things here. I gave myself some to-dos. I said I want to open the target with the selector. Here's the line, that'll do it. I had some non-working code that I commented out because I couldn't quite get rid of it because I might write some even worse non-working code after the working code that I comment out. And I know there's version control, but was I using it at the time? I don't even remember. Anyway, and then there is, you know, I have my favorite comment of all time here. I'm so surprised you all aren't laughing. And that's it, you know, you can see where I'm going here. Should I escape the U, or is it just love that it's there? I don't know what was going on, and I was really happy it was a list. I really needed it to be a list. And so if you were to want to contribute to a code base, like if you worked down the hall from me and you were like, oh, I want Veronica's like, you know, climbing wall open notification system to be even better, and then you open this up, what would you do? Yeah, you'd make that man noise and you'd run out the room. You would get away as quickly as possible and start your own project because this is illegible. It confuses me right now, and I wrote it. So this is not something any programmers want to look at. And like one could argue that maybe a programmer wasn't even writing it. Like, what is that? Would someone want to leave something like that? So what makes someone a programmer? Who agrees that air guitar on a keyboard might be a very important element? Okay, a few people. Look, I don't know what you do in your spare time, but like, okay, fine, it might just be me. So it's really important that we know our language and the methods that we use, whether that be with Python, other languages. Like there is always our set of rules and best practices and way of doing things. So like that piece of it is important. And we need to be applying problem solving and creative thinking, you know, thinking about, are we doing the thing that we want to do? And is this the best tool to use it? And then we need to like be able to write usable code, which I lacked at that time. And you know, there's that whole question of the air guitar thing. And we spend a lot of time on that first point about learning our language and methods. But I do think that the creative thinking and communicating pieces are just as important. And this is kind of like what fueled the commenting journey, maybe Jersey too, I don't know. And it's really an important part of getting the mastery that we all desire. So I started getting really interested in comments as I was talking to newer programmers. And I said, I'm seeing a lot of discrepancy in what we tell people is best practices. So we usually agree that doc strings consist of inputs, outputs, and a transformation. We can all agree that outdated comments are dirty, filthy lies. They're just bad. And I also hear a lot, too much is too much, whatever that means. Thank you, people of the internet. And then there's all these things that we're less sure about. We say you don't want to waste everybody's time. The comment is the code should be the how, and the comment should be the why. And the difficulty in the variation that we have around best practices for comments is that while it allows there to be room for different styles, like within languages, etc., it also can be really confusing to someone who's getting started and trying to learn everything at once. So, if you ask somebody, there's a lot of disagreement. We don't have the answer here, and I'm really surprised that cat is that okay with that image. And it's possible that the time spent labeling our cats, maybe at that point in coding, that's like what we need to be doing. Like, what is this doing really? Maybe it's obvious to someone else. But if you are that human and you go and you say, hey, internet, please help. I am learning and I need some help with that. They will say lots of things. And the take-home message is that only your code matters. And I'm used to seeing it. But if we're really honest with ourselves, and this is real advice given to me, these beautiful 3 words. Done, you can all go home. Everything's good, right? We're just gonna code better. It's fine. So the advice is refactor, you gotta code better. Don't use comments, only use the right comments, and only your code matters. So it's kind of like, you're sitting down at your computer and this guy keeps throwing up his hands yelling, stop, and he's not telling you what you should be doing instead. So, and I noticed that even in the most close-knit developer communities where people are gonna help each other out, and we're moving through this together, you would have someone who has 3 months more experience, 6 months more experience, turning and telling someone who's slightly newer, hey, you're doing it wrong, like that guy. And I think, I don't know if there's a little bit of I started wondering if there was a toxic beginner needs to know a little bit more kind of effect going on. But we're raising a lot of internet jerks. And I got more to say about internet jerks. So there's this human, and there's too many words on the slide, but there's this human that says, hey, I have this thoughtful question, I'm gonna lay it all out for you, and it's all nice, and I'm trying to figure out how to how many comments are too many comments, can you please help? And the response, what do you think the response is? Blamefulness? I think I heard somebody groan. It is pretty much that. This person says, this has been discussed to death. How about you go see this nice blog post from this famous jerk? And the subtext there, that's not what we want to be passing around. That's ugly. So, if we can, get past the, hey, this is what you should be doing, new programmer, why aren't you doing it? Don't you know my code speaks for itself, huh? And we can really remember, who remembers when they wrote their first comment or what they wrote, what they commented out in that first week? A couple of folks? A couple of folks are old and don't remember anything. Can those folks come back with us and just work with me here? Okay, so just work with me. They're really magic. So you're telling the interpreter, just ignore this and you could write your code a love letter. It would be, maybe that's how you feel. It's fine. So, you know, if you're pair programming next to someone and you're learning as much as you possibly can as quickly as possible, and this person says, oh, hey, you could use a, I can't think of a good example right now because I'm on a stage. But you could use something clever here, and you're like, oh, I have never heard of said clever thing, and you wrote yourself a nice little note in the margins so that you can Google it later and not like, you know, ask in that moment because you're already overwhelmed with all the stuff you're doing. Is that something you want to take away from somebody? It seems. So I made a special slide for all the folks that said that they couldn't remember what those first comments felt like. I forgot that slide was there, but I put it there especially for you, and I forgot. So when folks are newer to programming and they're like taking on all this new information, they tend to talk about it like this. I don't know what the fuck I've done tonight. I committed a lot of things to Git. I wrote something in JavaScript. Like, I'm cheering for Diane right now. I want Diane to stick it out. And what happens if we tell Diane, like, look, I see you coding and that's cool, but you gotta do it perfectly, okay? And like, here are some things that I saw folks using their comments for. You know, references, storage. Sometimes they would have like a to-do list, like an outline. Questions that they were going to ask a mentor when they could next get someone to like, you know, sit down and talk to them. Because sometimes that's really hard too. Is like, hey, want to come over and talk to me about my code? I'll cook you dinner and I'll be a total sweetie about it just so that, you know, we can sit together and you can answer my questions. Has anybody ever had to gone through that song and dance? Yeah, a couple heads nodding. Where it's like, look, I'll take you out to coffee. I'll do anything you want. So if only clean, comment-free code is okay, we wouldn't have good stuff like this. So just yesterday, I was talking to a dev that said, you know, as they put it, they want to get things working ASAP. They do, you know, like visual arts and like music type of things. So there's a lot of like live coding in their life. And they're like, I just want to plug stuff together and make sure it works before I make it beautiful. So they since they like to move fast and break things, I'd like to do a little shift and say, maybe we should like move fast and write bad comments. And maybe avoid breaking some things. So when they talked about the comments they wrote, they said, you know, they tended to be like, okay, to do, like plug in this thing and this thing will go here. And even I was just here because sometimes they're live coding and they know they want to change some element and they want to do something else and then go back to it and they just want a pointer for themselves. So it looks horrible and silly, but it's what works for them. Nobody's laughing because I already said the thing earlier, but like move fast and write bad comments. So I wanted to show you some of my earliest comments, but none of them exist. You know why? Because somebody told me that if I were going to be taken seriously as a developer, everything on my GitHub had to be clean code. Gross, right? Has anybody else heard that? A few people are nodding their heads. And I'm sorry, and I want you to like go back to that people, tell them they're wrong. And I have, I don't want to, I'm bearing the lead. Okay. So this caring friend who was like my advisor at the time, who really wanted me to be successful, and told me that I needed to do this, and I believed them. And then was so bummed out by it later. The next time I heard that somebody's commenting style was an anti-pattern, I really couldn't let it go. So I decided to take to Twitter, as we do when we're really mad about stuff. And I asked people, I said, how about you? Were you always dry? And I'm very popular on Twitter, very popular. So I got 9 votes on this poll, and you know, almost 50-50. If it had been 10, I bet it would have been 50-50, but we'll never know because I'm not that popular. Fine. So I started asking everybody about their commenting habits. And you know, with those 9 responses, I said, well, you know, maybe we're saving face. And you know, I extrapolated all these things, and I was finally like, you know what I need to do? I need to make a real poll with real results, and maybe more than 9 people will answer. So I'm about to show you too many words on a slide. And these are the questions I asked in my poll. And I'm going to point out a few things. So I asked some questions that are broadly, do we like comments in green? Do we not like comments in red? And you know, kind of demographic, some demographic questions, and what do you use the comments for up there at the top. And we'll talk about the data in gray and green and red, because I'm really interested like in the broad, like do we like them? Do we not like them? Anybody want to take a guess? Do we like comments in my poll or not? 50-50. I think it's going to be 46, whatever it was with the 9 people. That would be just too great. So let's look at some results. So, you know, what best describes your current or recent use of comments? And, you know, some 50, I think it was 57% people said, I use inline comments frequently. And I was like, what? The internet says that's like really bad practice and you're bad. So like a whole bunch of us are like really bad. And I think that's super that people are out there admitting it to themselves and to me. And so as you can see, other people add these comments when they're not certain what the code is doing. When at the function level, many are using them in line, and a good 18% of us are still, you know, commenting out that unused code. So like, don't feel too ashamed. So when do we add these comments? We tend to do them as we're experimenting and when others feel misunderstand. So if you're pairing with somebody and they're like, whoa, what's going on there? We just throw it in right there and it stays. And so I asked on a scale of 1 to 10, comments help me remember what my code does, agree or disagree. And I'm sorry I didn't label this super well. 10 is I strongly agree, and 1 is like, nah. So, you know, 40% are like, oh, hey, we pretty strongly agree, and then the tail happens. I ask comments help me clarify my thinking, and we have about the same shape. Comments can save current and future developers time. Everyone's like, yes, we know. And then I had to ask for my past self. Comments are helpful to an individual contributor building a project, but should be deleted before the project is shared. And those of you who also got my, you know, had the same advice when they were, this is not what the community believes is true. You can add your comments willy-nilly and however it feels best to you from now on. And then function level comments are acceptable, but inline comments are clutter. And you know, things start to spread out here. We're like, no, we actually really like those inline comments. We told you for Veronica, why did you ask a second time? I imagine they were thinking. Because there's a fair bit of disagreement. And then I ask the real moneymaker. Clear code is self-documenting and doesn't need those comments at all. And look at that lack of consensus. We just can't decide. Remember our nice tales from before? I miss data that has a clear answer. So I started to think like, maybe we should just be ignoring the internet jerks, and we should work, spend our time saying like, I'm going to develop the commenting style that works for me. And my favorite thing in the whole world right now is folks that put ASCII art within their comments to be like, hey, I have like this state machine, it's really complicated, maybe you need a nice little, you are here. And if you think this is fabulous, there's an ASCII art generator right here, so you could do a little like copy paste number. And thinking of this more broadly, I saw this quote, and it kind of struck me that like when we're making software, it's interesting to see what kind of problems we're solving and how we're solving them, like as another like level more abstract than like what and why are we doing it? Like going a little further into that why. And so if I had to write a really tweetable comment about that, I would say, in a sense, like what we draw in the margins is going to be showing us, is going to be a closer approximation to like where we are at as developers, like what is interesting us, like what is drawing us to this piece of software, and what kind of problems we're running into and how we're solving them. So what can we do? We kind of want to remember, Diane, our newbie coder, that's just doing the best she can. She did some work in JavaScript. Just put a lot of things up on Git. Who knows what's going on? We want to support folks. Like, I have some advice. So, if you can advise the current version of the person you're talking to and say, hey, I see that you did this thing, and it's probably not what you'll want to do forever, but I see your problem solving, it can be a lot more affirming than just being like, to be a real programmer. And you got to do it in that voice too. It's like pretty important because that's the programmer voice. So it's always suggesting a deep dive and reading others' code. A lot of folks suggested the book Clean Code as like a thing that changed their mind about coding. And we talked about some of the like numerical data that came out of this survey, but I asked several open-ended questions. And it was really interesting to me that people would write, I got like almost half-page responses that started out like, when I was a child, I believed this about documentation and coding. And now that I've like, used 5 different languages and seen all these things, it's like evolved in this way. And I'm like, that's amazing. And if anybody wants to talk to me about what to do with that data, I would be especially appreciative. And one thing I want us to all think about is what happens if we were to like rethink comments? Are comments kind of like docs? And if we start to say, comments are docs and we assert that, would we be making tools to make it easier to test our comments, to like make sure that they are up to date, to fix that comment rot? So I'm hoping that we can move forward with some of those ideas. This is me. And oh God. So earlier I had an emoji, like a big emoji on one of my slides. And when I tried presenting it, it like messed up because Unicode characters are gross sometimes and they do gross things on slides sometimes. And I looked over really quickly, my slide looked a little wrong and I panicked. But it's actually okay, please don't freak out with me, that was scary. So yeah, this is me if you want to reach out. If you want to tweet out the survey or anything, it's right there. Please don't take the survey because we all know what happens when you show some of your results to someone and then they take your survey and the data is sad forever and then I become a public crying on the floor because my data is bad. So yeah, that's me. We do have a couple minutes for questions and I'd love to hear what you have to say. Questions? Comments?
I thought it was interesting because I wonder about how other people feel about commenting. And I think one of the things people who are completely set against it. I can think of one example, like when you set a parameter or a variable, that in itself is not always explanatory. I think we find, this is why we're setting it, this is what happens if you don't set it, and, put some context around it.
Sure.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, so we had the comment about comments that it can, be helpful to set, when you're setting a param as a variable, sometimes it's a really good idea to add a bit in there. Yeah.
Just a comment on the talk. When I first started writing in Python, I didn't know what I was doing. Most people, when they're starting something new, and we had a team project, and nobody wanted to do the documentation. But, surprise, right? And so it was like, well, we need someone to write what we're doing in these functions. And I was like, okay, well, sure, I'd like to help. What do I do? And then they were like, you just have to write like parameters and what they are. And I just like type it in. So for me, it was like a very smooth entry into getting into coding. It was like, oh, I just tell it what to do? Well, that's fine. So like, I think comments can actually be used as a way to get people interested in sharing what they know. Like you said, they tell us about ourselves.
I think that's a really good point. Her entry was this during a group project. So there was a group project she needed, and they need folks to write documentation. Folks don't want to write documentation, maybe because we treat documentation like a second-class citizen. I don't know. So like folks didn't want to do that, and she's like, oh hey, how does this work? You mean I just need to add this in? And so the point being is this could be like a really good entry for folks who are like in that kind of situation. I think that's an excellent point. Yeah.
I don't want to mess up your data, but one thing that I would be interested in seeing a reaction to is you sort of asked questions about like in which places do you feel comments are appropriate, but I'm also interested in what kinds of comments do you feel are appropriate.
And I think, go ahead.
I think like the people that say, oh, your code should explain itself, like that's an okay attitude, and your code should be clear and easy to understand about how a comment like walking you through what it's doing.
Sure.
But often I think like even in that context, explaining why something is there, even if it's obvious what it's doing, is really useful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of nuance there certainly, and having that bit about the how versus the why is really important. And I do think that there might be a phase 2 of this survey that goes into what languages people are using, and tries to flesh out like comment types. I think would be a really important second set of questions to ask. I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think comments can be really helpful as a way of highlighting these are the things that I think are important in the code and like taking extra time for them. And so it makes sense that a new person is writing a lot of comments because everything is new and it is all like really important to you. And it just seems very similar to me, with when I first read like my first scientific papers, like I didn't know how to distinguish it's like everything is highlighted and you can't get anything out of it, just 2 words that aren't highlighted. I think it's a very similar thing where it's like you're just trying to understand what is important.
That's an excellent point. And when you look at a lot of folks get started with like the line by line tutorials, kind of the like Code Academy type of processes where they literally are like, write a line that does this and then you get the green light, and I think when people are in that stage, that can be really helpful. Anybody else got any thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that I think it really depends on your audience too. So like in my department, I've been using Python for a few years and I'm kind of the senior person, which probably sounds scary. But we have a lot of new people coming on, so commenting something that they rely on is pretty important. So I feel like you talked about changing a variable and losing an entire data set. That I kind of feel like I need to put labels on the bleach and stuff like that.
Sure.
The audience doesn't really know what they're working with or what the process is that's going on, that with the explanation to move through understanding what's actually happening.
There's there's a concept if we borrow concepts from other areas of engineering, and even, when we start looking at like risk assessments within code, there's questions of like urgency and the amount of risk. Like, what does this code connect to? Like, are we in finance? Is this, are we talking about people's monies or health data, et cetera? Like, so there's, I'm trying to remember. I talked to someone who was in mechanical engineering who, really quickly pointed and said, oh, kind of there was like a we have that moment. Like, oh, we do the same thing. Like, there's, these like different levels of risk you can have. I don't remember the words right now, but it was good to see that. Thanks for bringing that up. That's a good point. All right, we are gonna have to wrap up, but it's lunch now, so either get excited about lunch or get excited about, if you want to, chatting with me in this room for another couple minutes. So it's good having you all.